I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to a video conference edition of the New York Times Close Up. President Trump says he's very confident we'll have a coronavirus vaccine by the end of the year. He's talking about reopening the economy and restoring life in America as if the pandemic was nearly over. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, says the economy will be, quote, rocking by July. But a deeply reported front page story in the Times by Donald McNeil says not so fast. Quote, the scenario that Mr. Trump has been unrolling at his daily press briefings, that the lockdowns will end soon, that a protective pill is almost at hand, that football stadiums and restaurants will soon be full, is a fantasy, most experts say. Meanwhile, New York City, the epicenter of the pandemic, is grappling with not only the virus itself, but also how long it will take to get the city back to where it was just a few months ago. J. David Goodman, in his own front page Times story, reports it could take years. Quote, the very features that make New York attractive to businesses, workers, and tourists, Broadway, the subway system, world-class restaurants, and innumerable cultural institutions were among the hardest hit in the pandemic, and they will take the longest to come back. How long might it take to get back to normal, and what will the new normal look like? David Goodman is a Metro reporter for the New York Times, Donald McNeil Jr., a science and health reporter for the Times. Let's talk to both of them about where we're going. David, tell us now, we've got the mayor and the governor giving predictions about when we're coming back, predictions that don't look anywhere as optimistic as the president's. What's the latest assessment as to how things are going, and the governor's assessment as to the phases in which we're going to reopen the economy of the state?
Right. Well, so the governor has set up essentially a tiered system where the state would open regionally and not all at once, and it would do so in phases. And so there's a lot of moving parts that are going to have to come together for the whole state to sort of open up. And what that means is still really not clear. The governor laid out a plan that has some questionable elements in it. The most confusing and one that they couldn't really explain is that they have the education system opening last in the final phase of any regional sort of recovery. And when you talk to folks in New York City, they're very cognizant of the fact that without the school system open, a lot of people aren't going to be able to go back to work. And one of the issues that you have is it's very easy, and as we've reported, it's quite, even though it was as difficult as it was, it's easy to close down a city relative to how difficult it's going to be to stand it back up. Because it really isn't like you put one block here and then another block. And that's sort of how the governor's plan is. You start with construction, then you move to some office workers, then maybe you go to restaurants, and then finally to big event spaces and other kinds of arts and entertainment. That's where he puts education. But in reality, the economy of the city and of most places is a real networked thing that you almost have to get ready and stand it all up at once. And that's not how this is going to happen. And so it's going to sort of happen piecemeal and in fits and starts. That's what people are saying. But they're also saying it's going to be months away here. We're at the very earliest. I mean, the state is looking to open up on May 15th in some regions, but New York City will not at all be among those to see the early reopenings.
Donald McNeil, you had a front page story in the Times that really painted a kind of dismal picture of this whole pandemic. And you've covered pandemics, you've covered epidemics before all over the world. Explain to me, and I have to admit, maybe I'm naive and I don't quite get this, but this seems to be the kind of thing that you would have expected in the Middle Ages and in medieval times, that in the 21st century, we would have had the technology, the medical capacity, the hospital facilities to be able to cope with something like this without shutting down the entire world economy. Now we're hearing that perhaps 1 in 5 people may have had the disease, have the antibodies for it. How did this suddenly sweep the world? All of a sudden, something that we never even heard of 6 months ago, and now nearly everyone in one way or another is affected by it, and we've had tens and tens of thousands of deaths resulting from it. Where did this come from? How did this happen? How did it just get out of control?
It happened exactly the way it did last time, except that none of us are 102 years old to remember what happened last time. This is 1918 all over again. It does not matter how good your cancer hospitals are. It does not matter even how good your emergency rooms are. When you do not have a vaccine and you have a virus that is both lethal and highly transmissible, you are just dust in its path. I mean, it blows through you like a hurricane, and that's what it's doing to us right now. I mean, we've had many close calls before. SARS was a very, very lethal virus, killed about a third of its victims, is related to this virus. About 10% of its victims, but doesn't transmit very easily. We had the H1N1 flu, the swine flu back in 2009, and that one whipped through the population, infecting virtually, probably 70% of the people in the world over the course of 2 years. But it was a relatively mild virus. It caused fewer deaths than the typical flu. Now we've got the combination that doctors have been warning against for years and years. This is the big one. And we haven't seen a big one since 1918, not this big. And almost everyone expected it to be an influenza virus, a bird flu that went transmissible. But this time it turned out to be a coronavirus. And I know a couple of scientists who had been predicting that, but most of them hadn't. And so right now we're totally helpless in front of it. We have to just distance ourselves from each other. Wearing masks makes a huge difference. But somebody was shot dead yesterday because a security guard, because he tried to make somebody wear a mask. We've got gigantic psychological problems in the United States against accepting the reality of what's happening and protecting ourselves against it.
And do we become so complacent that we just expect that with modern medicine, we're going to have a vaccine in a couple of months and perhaps something preventatively, a pill we can take, and all of this will go away and we can just forget about it?
I think Donald Trump thinks that, but I think anybody who's got a degree in medicine or even some serious common sense knows that injecting bleach is a bad idea. Sticking high energy ultraviolet lights inside your lungs is a bad idea. The fastest we've ever made a vaccine in our lives is 4 years, and that was the mumps vaccine. We can speed it up. We can probably do it in less than that, but you can't drop the safety testing because some vaccines have a tendency to actually make the problem worse and make you more likely to get the disease. And we have to absolutely make sure that doesn't happen. And a prophylactic pill, we don't have any pill that looks like it would work as a prophylactic. I mean, we've recently gotten remdesivir that appears to be helpful in saving people who are near death, but remdesivir is an injection, not a pill, and we have no indication it would work if you just popped it like an aspirin. And if such a pill arrived, we'd have to find a way to make 300 million of them for every American to take every day. It would have to become as ubiquitous as aspirin. So that's another obstacle.
David, we have proved to be very resilient in New York before. We came out of the 1918 flu epidemic. We came out of the draft riots. We came out of 9/11. We came out of the 2008 recession. Why is this different? Why are people predicting that the impact of this is going to be so much greater? And of course, we've seen things now, including the shutdown of the subway overnight, that are, by New York City standards, at least, certainly unprecedented. How long are they going to last? What is the enduring impact of this pandemic likely to be?
There's a couple of things that make this different. I mean, a lot of people early on were comparing it to 9/11 and saying, the city had come back from 9/11 and we can come back from this. But then when, this started to drag on, people realized this wasn't going to end quickly. They started to talk about it being like a 9/11 basically every week or every day. It's constant. It's not ending. And that's put the city in a position of not being able to heal itself. One of the things that Mayor Bloomberg offered after 9/11 was, everyone needs to come back to Broadway, and that's how we're going to stand up, the city. We need to increase tourism. Well, you can't have any tourists come to New York City. The hotels right now are filled with either people that work for FEMA, for healthcare, for hospitals, and increasingly homeless and people that are infected with the virus. I mean, the city is essentially on a deep freeze right now, and there's not a way that anyone has articulated to bring it back for the very reason that Don was saying. I mean, this is not an event that happened and we're recovering from. It's something that the greatest danger comes from other people. And when I spoke to the governor a few weeks ago about this, and we talked about his preparations and his slowness in the early stages to really recognize the danger here, he was analogizing it to hurricanes. And the thing that he wasn't really, and he said his greatest fear was panic. And he had seen after Katrina the kind of panic that came and the danger that comes from people worrying. And my response to him and my follow-up question was that, did he see that how this was different in the sense that the people themselves are the hurricane, and people did in fact need to worry about each other in a way that he was telling people not to, and in a sense making people so comfortable that they didn't take it seriously for as early as they needed to, and so it kind of got out of control both in the state and the city.
One of the other things that's kind of interesting is that Mayor de Blasio is the first mayor that I remember, the first progressive mayor politically, who has been operating with a surplus, operating in a good economy. Now suddenly he's got to deal with giant deficits as a result of this pandemic. Where is that going to place him in terms of the budget, in terms of the things that he's promised to be able to accomplish?
Right. Well, he doesn't have a surplus anymore. I think what they're predicting now is about $7.5 billion shortfall over the next. They're going to be a shortfall this year, which they were not predicting earlier in this current fiscal year that we're in. And then in the next fiscal year, if you combine those two together, by the time you get to middle of 2021, you'll be short $7 billion. So he's already facing the kinds of choices he never had to make before. And what he did over his first 6 years was really increase the size of the city workforce. That's actually helped a bit in this, in this economic downturn. You still have a lot of people that are getting paid by the city and that are still working and can be, put to work to keep the city running. The problem is that the city can't afford to have that kind of workforce indefinitely, most likely. And so they've already started to do cuts in city services, not major ones that you would notice, but they're cutting various things. The mayor said, they're going to close the beaches because we probably shouldn't have people going to beaches right now, but also he's not sure that it really makes sense to pay for them. They can't afford it right now. And I think we're going to see more and more things like that New Yorkers have grown accustomed to, and the mayor has grown accustomed to throwing money at every problem that's come up and creating new services and new systems to deal with them. The mental health system that he's stood up for $1 billion. A lot of these things are going to have to come down, and a lot of the agencies are going to have to make choices about how many of the people that we hired did we really need.
And Donald, you said that one of the reasons we've gained so much, or to whatever extent we've gained on this pandemic, is that we've shut down the country, in effect. That's a situation that can't continue indefinitely. So what are the measures medically, socially, that are likely to continue for us to keep this pandemic under control in the immediate future?
Well, you have to remember the pandemic is not under control. It's under control in New York State in that our caseloads, our deaths, and our hospitalizations are going down. So we've begun to flatten the curve, but it's not back to where it was before this started. In many other states, they're opening up as their deaths and new cases and hospitalizations are increasing. And experts say that is suicidal because your situation is out of control, but you don't yet know how out of control it is. And you know that you're taking a measure that's going to make deaths and hospitalizations go up again. So, if you're looking for a metaphor for this, rather than 9/11, because 9/11 was over in minutes. I mean, the threat was gone once the two planes had hit the buildings. This is more like the Blitz, in London. I mean, imagine you're living in London. You've got to keep the economy going, but the German planes just keep coming. And imagine if they came day and night too. And, in London, you could count on the bombers coming at night. You could get out, go to your job during the day, and then go back into the bomb shelter at night. And the bomb shelters protected you. We are basically in a giant bomb shelter right now, trying to stay out of the path of this invading virus. But as we come out of the bomb shelters, we have to choose basically how many of our friends and neighbors can we accept seeing die in order to keep the shelter working. The difference between now and 1918 is that we know we'll eventually have a vaccine. We know we will probably also have monoclonal antibodies or maybe even a pill to sort of hold this in check. So the longer we can hang on, the more we can flatten the curve, since we know there's an end to it, the more lives we can save. So I completely disagree with the people who say that the cure is worse than the disease, and we should just get out there and let it go through, and let the weak die, which is actually a poster I've seen outside. I think we've got to go out extremely carefully. So forget about football stadiums and things like that. It means that people like us who can work from home are going to have to continue working from home. People who can do construction jobs and things like that, where they can work outdoors, can do that. The hard part is going to be people who are in the service economy, where you have to be face-to-face with your customers. And we're going to have to rebuild factories and stores and everything so that there's plexiglass between us and the customers, and make people wear masks, and do everything we can to basically reduce the opportunity to inhale one other's exhalations, which is the big danger, as much as possible, and see that we can keep the new infections and deaths down as much as possible. And to what David said, the schools are actually the toughest part. They're the toughest decision for any governor, because we don't know very much about how much of a role children play in spreading the virus. The more data that comes out, the more it looks like they do spread the virus. And the problem is, the kids can go to school, and the kids are 99.something% likely to be fine. But schools also collect adults in the form of the teachers and the staff. The parents bring the kids to school, so you're bringing together a lot of adults again. Mm-hmm. And then those kids go back home, and they give the disease to mom and dad. And if grandma lives in the house, they give it to grandma. And so kid is fine. Mom and dad are maybe go to the hospital with pneumonia, and grandma dies. And that's not the way you like your society to live. That's not, we don't normally choose to say goodbye, grandma, because Johnny's got to go to school.
David, quickly, what do you foresee as the new normal a year from now in New York City, with the economy and politically or in any other way? What are we going to get used to and see that we're going to be doing differently a year from now?
Wow, I don't know. It's hard to predict what we're going to be doing in August. That's going to be wildly different than this, and then predicting a year from now. I think there's going to be a lot of more creative ways of trying to get commerce going that don't involve face-to-face. You're already seeing things like, scheduled pickups for goods. Stores are trying to have curbside, sales, so they can at least, you order online, but maybe you pick it up at the store. Ways to support small businesses in neighborhoods that can sustain that. When a place like Midtown comes back, I don't know. I think a year from now, we might still be in the same place, more or less, that we are today, if we don't have a medical breakthrough. Because you can open back up all you want, but are people going to want to come back is a different question. And office workers that can stay home will stay home the longest. That's what everyone has been saying to me. And if office workers don't come back to New York City, then the businesses that they support won't come back. And you won't have, if there's no vibrancy to the middle of Midtown, why would tourists want to come there? If there's no shows to go to, even if the hotels are open, and they have all kinds of safety precautions, I don't see why someone besides adventure tourists would want to be visiting New York City. So I think there's a lot of things that have to happen, and a lot of safety that people have to start to feel. I think the subway is a really big question. I don't know if people are going to be riding the subway in any major way a year from now, if there's not a way to feel that you're safe in doing so. And so, I think it's hard to say what a year from now will bring, but it's also hard to imagine without some kind of medical breakthrough, something that isn't halfway towards what we used to know.
David Goodman, Donald McNeil Jr. of the New York Times, thanks for joining us. And coming up next, how the coronavirus is impacting both the subway system and the homeless. We'll hear from Nikita Stewart of the New York Times. Subway ridership is down over 90% since the COVID pandemic began, and that put the subway system in a financial crisis. But so many homeless people sleeping on the subways became a health crisis. Governor Cuomo responded with an unprecedented overnight shutdown of the subways for disinfecting. Nikita Stewart wrote about it in a front page story in last Sunday's New York Times. Quote, Generations of homeless people have used the New York City subways as protection against the elements and a place to unsoundly sleep. But with little access to showers or medical care, they have become a health hazard during the coronavirus epidemic. We should mention that about 100 transit workers have also died from COVID-19. Let's talk about the impact of an intersection of several crises, the coronavirus, the subways, and the homeless, with New York Times reporter Nikita Stewart. Nikita, how is this affecting the homeless in particular? Obviously, it's affecting lots of New Yorkers in different ways, including subway workers, including ordinary New Yorkers. What about the homeless in particular?
You mean in terms of the pandemic?
Yeah.
As soon as the pandemic began, I worried immediately about homeless people who are single adults who live in congregate settings. And so you have to understand that shelters for single adults are dormitory style, and the beds are very close together, and there can be as many as 12 people sleeping in one room, and all of the bathrooms are shared. So that is just, a field for the virus. And so you already saw a high number of single adults testing positive for COVID-19. But at the same time, people are afraid of the shelters because of people were not able to be on the street because there's no one to panhandle. The bathrooms are closed. It's just difficult. So what's the best option when you don't have shelters and you don't have your regular public gathering places, your atriums, etc.? The subway. And so especially overnight, it was basically just cars were nothing but people who didn't have housing.
And what about school kids too? School kids who are homeless, living in shelters, hotels, some of them not having access to internet, which has become crucial to teaching kids in distance learning.
Yes, what's interesting is the single adult population in shelters has gone up. The population is at record numbers. But
what are we up to now, roughly?
More than 17,000. And usually we're looking at 15,000, 16,000. So that's very unusual. But at the same time, we have the number of families with children has gone down because families have decided to stay doubled up instead of trying to enter the shelter system at this time because of just the uncertainty of the virus. And so, for example, at a high, there are like 23,000 children in shelter. Right now, there are about 19,000. So that is a tremendous drop. But inside the shelters, even though they don't have to share bathrooms and they have units to themselves, families with children had difficulty at the beginning of the pandemic because of the lack of internet and devices. So that is still being resolved for some people. But, everywhere you turn, everyone is dealing with the pandemic, but it is especially hard on people experiencing homelessness.
What about the shutdown of the subway at night? How is that affecting people who have to go to work at night, who traditionally use the subway at night? We often don't think of them. And is that likely to last, or is this going to be very much a temporary thing, do you think?
Well, as far as I know, right now, this looks pretty indefinite until the pandemic is under some kind of control or until we have a vaccine, right? Yeah, my colleagues went out overnight to see how the first night of the shutdown, how it went. And surprisingly, a lot of homeless people decided to go ahead and accept help and were pretty you know, they just understood what was happening, and more than half of the 250 people decided to go ahead and enter shelter. And that is a very high number. Usually it's like 20 people a night. So that is amazing. But at the same time, people who needed to get to work, essential workers who didn't understand what was happening, they were very upset about the situation because the city is going to have shuttle buses, et cetera. Now people are like, well, what time am I going to get to work? You know, there's a lot to work out.
And we forget how many people really do have to get to work at night. And even with a lot of the city shut down, people do work at night, have those jobs to go to, and many of those we do take for granted. Nikita, thank you very much for joining us. And before we go, I want to congratulate our Pulitzer Prize winners, Brian Rosenthal of the New York Times for his series on taxi drivers and their struggle to maintain income, and Nicole Hannah-Jones for her series on the 1619 Project, and our series on Vladimir Putin as well. And thank you for joining us, Nikita Stewart of the New York Times, for the New York Times and CUNY TV and the New York Times Close Up. I'm Sam Roberts.